If you drive for about 3 hours down the coast of California from San Francisco to about the Big Sur area, you come into a retreat center that's called the Esalen Institute. It was founded in the 1960s, and it's where Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary enjoyed drug-induced mysticism, and where Ravi Shankar taught George Harrison a sitar lesson. It was established to be a laboratory for new thought, allowing people to get into the business of discovering truth, spiritual truth, or the ethical truth of how we might behave in society. It's interesting that these days, many of the attendees are coming from the Silicon Valley. Executives from Apple, Google, Twitter, Airbnb, Intel, and Xerox. And it seems that there is a collective concern in Silicon Valley that their hopes and dreams for technology haven't exactly worked out. The CEO of Esalen, Ben Tauber, lamented about this in 2017 when he said, "There's a dawning consciousness emerging in Silicon Valley as people recognize that their conventional success isn't necessarily making the world a better place." And he tells us that the CEOs out there are hurting, that they can't sleep at night. So what he's doing is that today he's putting on conferences with names like Responsible Tech or Wisdom 2.0, in which they're asking profound questions like, how should we make sure that we're ethical about exercising this kind of control over people's minds and brains? So it seems like they're having a crisis of conscience. Well, that's a good thing. A few sleepless nights, be kept awake, wondering if we are responding to the gospel challenge today to be salt and light for our world rather than just continuing to contribute to the bitterness that's around us. I'm sure if each one of us stops and reflects on all the decisions that we make, and if we're honest with ourselves, we don't always do what's best for us or what's best for the world. That sometimes we can easily get caught up in our dark sides. It's the human condition. It's what humanity is all about. Walt Whitman wrote about it in a very famous poem entitled Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. It's about a man reflecting on going home from work from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and is reflecting on the human condition, on our humanness. And part of the poem goes, "I am he who knew what it was to be evil. I too knitted the old knot of contrariety, blabbed, blushed, resented, lied, stole, grudged, had guile, anger, lust, hot wishes I dared not speak, was wayward, vain, greedy, shallow, sly, cowardly, malignant, the wolf, the snake, the hog, not wanting in me, the cheating look, the frivolous word, the adulterous wish, not wanting, refusals, hates, postponements, meanness, laziness, none of these wanting." Whitman truly understood the human condition. He understood that we're all capable of some of those things. So it's good to have a crisis of conscience at points in our lives that hopefully leads us to growth and repentance. You see, that's what Isaiah in that first reading was all about. He was challenging the Israelite people because they had given into their dark sides. And interestingly enough, he doesn't call them to just apologize and just to say they're sorry. No, he challenges them that to do better, they've got to do some things, like they've got to share their bread with the hungry and clothe the naked and the homeless and remove from their midst oppression and false accusation and malicious speech. And he tells them that only then Will they be light and salt for the world? As I read that first reading and preparing this homily, one couple of words really struck me. Malicious speech. Remove malicious speech, which we seem to be overwhelmed with these days. And maybe that's why some of the CEOs of Silicon Valley aren't sleeping well, because they provided us with so many more avenues for people to simply be malicious. Now, we will soon be entering the Lenten season. And so as I was writing this, I was thinking, well, maybe that's what we need to fast from this year. Not candy or wine or whatever, but malicious speech. Wouldn't that be a better kind of fasting? To focus on how we treat each other, how we talk to each other, how we talk about each other, how we write about people, whether we're just writing in Instagram or whatever. How we treat people, though. Because I think if we are honest enough with ourselves, we can all be malicious at times. And the gospel calls us to be light and salt. And malicious speech only brings darkness into this world. So a crisis of conscience for corporations or each of us individually can be good. Force us to ask profound questions about, are we searching for truth? How can we do better to be to add more positive things to life rather than negative things? Because lately it seems that so much of our world has sunk into such darkness in how we do treat each other. And there's another whole area of this too that came to me as I was reflecting on this. And the challenge is, what are we modeling for our young people? What are our young people learning from this kind of culture of hate speech? It takes me back to that very poignant Rodgers and Hammerstein song, very simply entitled, "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." You may remember it. It goes, you've got to be carefully taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed into your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. So what are we carefully teaching our young? A crisis of conscience is a good thing. A few sleepless nights to ask ourselves some profound questions about whether we are light and salt, or are we just contributing negativity and more bitterness? So perhaps during this Lenten season, each one of us can ask ourselves, are we carefully teaching our young not to hate those who are different from us, and how to lovingly speak to one another and write about one another in our emails or on Instagram or on texts? Isaiah has quite the challenge for all of us, that besides clothing the naked and feeding the hungry, do away with oppression and malicious speech. And then we might be able to be salt and light. So maybe for all of us, a course in Wisdom 2.0 could be a good thing. To each one of us ask ourselves about the ethical truth of how we ought to behave in society.